Welcome to our Together on Mission podcast, brought to you by the Baptist Union of Victoria and hosted by our Director of Mission and Ministries, Rev Daniel Bullock. Daniel will be joined by a guest from our Victorian Baptist family each week for a brief discussion that aims to encourage you in your personal walk of faith and give you some practical suggestions that you can implement through your week. Throughout this year, the podcast will be focusing on the theme of being and sharing the good news. In this episode, Daniel is joined by Rev Jonathan Stark, who has been the head of the Pastoral Leadership Support and Development Team at the BUV Support Hub for the last 7 years. Prior to this role, Jonathan had pastored churches in Metro and Regional Victoria. Now let's hear from Daniel and Jonathan.
Well, welcome back to our podcast. Today, once again, I have Jonathan Stark with me. Jonathan, it's great that you could join me for another week. It's fantastic to have you. Last week, you talked about your role, what you do as the leader of the PLNSD team, the Pastoral Leadership and Support and Development Team. I wonder if you just maybe share with our listeners a little bit about your family and the church and what do you do in the church?
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me back, Daniel. I'm married to Mandy Stark. She's a pastor at Sindal Baptist, an associate pastor there for discipleship and connection. And I've also got two daughters. Alex, she's married to Wes, and they live down in Hastings, and they've got one little baby. So I've got one grandson, his name's Moses.
Moses.
And then my second daughter is Georgia, and she's engaged to Caleb and getting married in December. So a lot of things happening. Soon it'll just be Mandy and I at home. But it's been great having this family that have been so good to live with.
Okay, and your wife, Mandy's a pastor at Sindal Baptist,
Yep.
and you're involved there. From what I understand, you help out with Alpha a lot.
That's right, yeah. We love Alpha, Daniel. We've done it so many times, countless times in different churches that I've pastored, but now doing it with Mandy, supporting her and the team that do it together. And we've seen a lot of people come and have their lives changed, which has been so encouraging through this. We love it.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, we're going to have a bit of an emphasis on Alpha next year in the churches across Victoria. So our listeners will probably hear a little more about that in the coming months, but also early next year. Thanks, Jono. We'll come back with you. I've got a couple of questions I want you to ponder as I share this reflection. Recently, myself and 3 staff members from the BUV Support Hub attended a conference of Baptist denomination leaders from around Australia and the Pacific in Darwin. The conference started on a Monday, so I thought it would be a good idea to take advantage of the weekend beforehand and to do a hike. So I invited everyone who was attending the conference to come hiking with me over the weekend. Well, it would be fair to say the response to my invitation was underwhelming. Only my guest here today, Jonathan Stark from the BUV Hub, agreed to join with me on that hike. The hike we did was a 3-day, 2-night hike around the tabletop circuit in Litchfield National Park, around about 50 k's by the time we finished it. I think officially it's about 39, but we took a few extra detours and what have you. To cut a long story short, this would have to be one of the most challenging yet least inspiring hikes I have done. It was challenging not because there were massive hills or really long distances to walk, but simply because of the heat. It was about 35 degrees each day, and it started about 25 degrees. So it was very, very challenging in relation to heat. It was uninspiring because the terrain was quite dry, barren, and it could be described as heartless. Now, don't get me wrong. Along the way, there were some great spots, waterfalls, creeks, and riverbeds to swim in. But overall, the walking between the highlights was not overly stimulating. While I was glad to do the hike, I must admit I was very, very glad to finish the hike. And I'm pretty sure, Jonathan, that you were pretty glad to finish that hike. Often when we look at the demands of life or the road ahead of us in life, it can seem overwhelming and sometimes even uninspiring. A young person or a young couple wanting to purchase a house looks at the massive expense, the interest rates and the cost of living factors and sees no hope, just the prospect of a mountain of debt. Halfway through studying the degree, the joy of being accepted into the degree has worn off and we find ourselves in the midst of slogging through a heavy study schedule. There are many things like this in life. We set out on a path with enthusiasm, but that enthusiasm soon turns into hard work or simply a drudging walk. For me, setting out on a multi-day hike is exciting, but after a day or two, especially if the conditions are demanding, it can seem like I'm never going to get there. I imagine the middle of a marathon race would be very, very similar. Yet people buy houses and they chip away at the debt throughout their lives. Hikes get completed, and more people seem to be running marathons these days. In fact, I saw a sign in the gym a little while ago that said, 1 step forward is 1 step further than standing still. The key to progressing in life and faith is to move 1 step at a time. In Acts chapter 20, along with many other places in Paul's letters, the Apostle Paul uses the analogy of running a race as a metaphor for the discipleship journey. In Acts 20:24, he says, I consider my life worth nothing to me. My only aim is to finish the race and complete the task the Lord Jesus has given me, the task of testifying to the good news of God's grace. The race Paul talks about would take him his entire life to achieve. Indeed, it would take him via chains, shipwrecks, into humble homes and into halls of power. The key for Paul in his life and faith journey, regardless of the terrain, regardless of the challenges of the journey, was to keep moving 1 step after the other step. I think this metaphor is apt for our discipleship journey and especially important in ministry. When we feel like giving up, just take another step, then another, and before we know it, the house is paid off, the degree is completed, the hike is accomplished, the marathon conquered. And for those of us in ministry, ministry fruit is born. I think perseverance and faithfulness are often underrated in our society, and to be honest, often underrated in our church today. Yet the Apostle Paul pretty much says it is central to our personal flourishing and indeed the flourishing of our church and our ministry. So Jonathan, you joined me on the walk through Litchfield National Park. From your perspective, how was it? Was it as bad as I described it, or better than that?
Well, Daniel, I would say it was definitely a test of perseverance and faithfulness. The question I was asking right through was I prepared to keep going and be faithful to what I'd set out to do? And that question just kept going over and over in my mind, and it didn't stop until we finished the walk. So Litchfield National Park, it's just south of Darwin, and it's so beautiful to visit by car or in a 4-wheel drive where you can go to the falls and do all that, but walking it with a 15 to 20 kilo pack on your back in 35 degrees days, that really called for perseverance. I think there were a couple of times when you said to me, do you want to take a break? And I bravely responded, yes, please. I was sweating. I was very tired. I could hardly talk, and I knew there was a long way to go. But we wanted this to be a story of survival, didn't we, Daniel? And we wanted to be able to tell other people, like the listeners on this podcast, that we made it to the end. So we put one foot in front of the other, as step by step we kept going until we made it back to the car. And what a great return to the car that was. Lots of celebrating.
Yeah, well, it's fantastic. And then we told all the other guys what they missed out on, these great hikes that they could have done. But next time, maybe we'll have a hike and they'll all join us, and maybe we'll pick one.
We hope it inspires them.
Maybe you pick one slightly easier. Well, Jonathan, whether it's phrased as perseverance or faithfulness or steadfastness or endurance, not giving up or not growing weary, we see verse after verse in the Bible about this. Why do you think this is such an important theme in the Bible?
Well, look, I agree. It is an important theme. And I think the reason it's so important is because life can get very hard. I think we can get physically exhausted. We can get spiritually dry. We face all kinds of criticism. We can become isolated, overwhelmed, and we need to persevere. And I think we need to be faithful. We need to endure. And I think that God knows this and that he knows that it's going to get difficult. And so he makes it so clear that we need to be prepared. So it's not a surprise to us. So God wants us to not be surprised when things get really tough. So giving up, throwing in the towel, being unfaithful is a lot easier, but perseverance brings great rewards. I think that's why James writes in James 1:12 that the one who perseveres under trial will receive a crown of life. And I think there are great rewards for those who keep going, one step at a time. And God wants us to know that, especially when things are tough.
Yep, absolutely. Well, just like I exercise and stay in shape, which helps me to persevere on something like a challenging hike, what are some things you think we can do to help us persevere spiritually when things get tough?
Well, I think we forget how crucial it is for pastors to persevere spiritually.
Yep.
I mean, this is our calling, Daniel. This is our work, and people look to us on how to follow Jesus. Yeah. They hope that we will be people that are genuinely following Jesus, so we can be an example for them to follow of trusting, of persevering through the tough times. And that's why I think it's so sad when pastors, people, but pastors particularly, give up. A wise pastor, I think, thinks ahead. They realise they're likely to be in seasons when it seems like every day is 35 degrees and there's a heavy load on their pack and it's a long way from home. So what I would say for pastors is to have that reality, when they have that reality in their ministry, this is the kind of advice I'd give them. There are a few crucial things that I think we all need to have when the going gets tough. Daniel, we had a lot of water on that hike. I mean, you gave me advice beforehand that I hadn't taken before, but you said to me, you need to get these things. It wasn't cellulites, it was electrolytes.
Electrolytes, yeah.
That's right. But you said if I take those, that would help me maintain water because I'm going to be sweating a lot. And we carried 3 to 5 litres of water each day, even though it was heavy to carry that. But it was so crucial that we had water. Why? Well, you can't survive in the heat without water. You can't keep going if you don't have water. And I reckon prayer is like that, Daniel. I'm talking about the kind of prayer where you're pouring out your heart to God. You're doing it honestly. You're doing it vulnerably. You're doing it regularly. And I think at times when things are absolutely crucial, to have been regularly praying to God, being in that rhythm, crying out to God for help and for encouragement, that's what you need to have. It's absolutely crucial. I think that's the first thing. I think another thing I would recommend is that together, you and I, when we were there, we started walking, didn't we?
Yeah,
now you walked much faster than I did. Like from at the start, you took off and I tried to keep up. But boy, it was hard. I was thinking, this guy wants to run. and to be honest, you were probably thinking, is this guy going to move? He's like that person who, if one step forward is more than staying still, you probably thought I was staying still. But I remember feeling through that, we started to walk closer together. I think you slowed down because you didn't want me to be on my own, and I sped up than what I normally would. And we found somewhere in between where we could walk together. I think the second thing that's so crucial when you're on your own is that you've got people with you.
Yep.
You had the map. If you took a wrong way on your own and I didn't have the map and we weren't together, it would have been life and death for me. And so we needed each other. We called out to each other. We learnt from each other. And I think that was absolutely crucial for us together. And I think it's the same in ministry. Many people, when stuff gets really difficult and the challenges are there, sometimes think they've just got to face it on their own. They've just got to find, the way forward. But I think if you can share the load If you've got a ministry team, if you've got people who are, that are for you in the church, let other people share the journey with you. Ask other people to help you carry the load. I think this can happen with supervisors, with mentors, with your family as well, to make sure that together you're not on your own. So I think having others with you is just crucial. The last thing I'd say, Daniel, this was a terrible walk. Well, we loved it in the end, looking back. Yeah. But I don't think we're heading back to Litchfield for a hike in 35 degrees again. But the one thing that was good about this hike is there was the hope of water, wasn't there? There were some falls along the way. There were some rivers that we walked by. And every time we got to these, we looked ahead for them. And whenever we saw them, we just jumped in and cooled down and kept going. And I think if you're going through a tough time, you need to plan ahead and find out where are the oasis points. Where can I have a rest? Yep. Where can I disengage? And it might be taking a really good holiday. It might be having some spiritual retreat. But you and I, we started the day, and I remember you saying, I've looked ahead. There's going to be water when we're about halfway through or towards the end of the day. Let's look forward to that. That gave me hope in the midst of this. And it also meant that we weren't just boiling all day. We had some great breaks. And I think if you're in the midst of times where it seems there's no way ahead, it's so hard, yes, take one step after the other, but already plan now for holidays and rest where you can get through. So I'd say those things, prayer,
that is rich. That is really, really good, Jonathan. Thank you very much for sharing that. I'm sure that's just great practical advice that just helps us along the long journey of life. My prayer for those who are listening, that you would indeed be faithful. You would indeed take one step after another through life's challenges, through ministry challenges, but then you would find those places of oasis and refreshment along the way. Until next week, may you know love and the blessings of God. Thank you.